Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this In the Hot Seat session at the studio. My name's Doug Drinkwater. I'm the Director of Strategy here at Hot Topics, and in this session, we're looking at the journey to becoming a non-exec director. I'm joined by an experienced panel of marketing leaders and non-exec directs. I have Ruth Rowan, who is the CMO from Avanade, Leo Franks, who is Business Development and Marketing Director at Kingsley Napoli, Simonetta Rigo, Group CMO from Evelyn Partners, and Catherine Gallagher, who is the NED at Eubank. Well, thanks for joining me today. Now, In the Hot Seat is a new format, so if you have any questions today and you're with us in person, put your hand up and we'll get a roving mic to you as soon as we can. If you are watching virtually, please do put your question into the Hop-In platform, and once again, we'll get to that as soon as we can. So what are we discussing today? Well, we're discussing the role, the responsibilities, the purpose of becoming a non-exec director, the professional development journey that you need to go on before you can take such a position, and ultimately how you can translate some of these learnings, some of these experiences back into your day job. So I'm going to start by essentially how all four of you see the role of a non-exec director today, what you see in terms of the responsibilities. So Leo, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I do a variety of roles, primarily in the not-for-profit pro bono arena, so my remarks are going to be contextualized around that. And I feel four primary responsibilities for the roles that I hold. The first one is around offering constructive challenge to the executives of the organizations that I support. And what I mean by that is not being afraid to dissent and disagree, to challenge what they're saying, but in a pragmatic and diplomatic fashion to help them progress, often asking the questions that other execs around the table are unwilling to ask. So I think that's the first element of the roles that I see. The second for me is something that as marketeers, hopefully, that will be natural to all of us, and it's around bringing the outside in, offering an external perspective. Sometimes, possibly we all, in the organizations we work for, become myopically focused on the day-to-day, so offering that external context can be helpful as an NED. The third thing for me, again, relates to the technical specialism that many of us share, and it's around being an expert at the table in marketing comms matters. Some of the boards I'm involved in have other marketeers, others do not. And the fourth and final point, before I bore everyone to tears, is about representing stakeholders of some fashion, depending on the organization. That could be people in the community, it could be investors, it could be participants in the organization. So it's that range, it's the piece about challenge, it's the piece around the outside, it's the piece around being the expert, and finally representing stakeholders. At least that's what I see.
Ruth, what's your thought?
Thank you. I mean, beautifully done. I should say what he said. So I'm really privileged, as well as doing my day job for Avanade, that I'm a trustee and board member for Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. And just have one NED role, which I've definitely learned one at a time is definitely enough if you're also doing another day job. And I'd add to that, kind of under the stewardship of the chair of the organisation, who ultimately runs the board. So it's interesting, there is a difference, isn't there, from being led by the CEO to being led by the chair, because it is a different agenda as a NED. But really, we have two things. One is to make sure that the strategy for the organisation is right, which is everything that you've just been talking about, Leo, around what that looks like, but to ensure that the strategy is robust and it's the right strategy for the market and the opportunity right now. And then secondly, which for me certainly as a CMO is really interested in ensuring the correct governance of the organisation, which is where it gets really serious as a NED, because you're legally accountable for the organisation's performance and success. And some of the things that we can get wrong in the organisation involve jail terms, don't they? So, that for me is kind of when you put your grown-up shoes on. But for me, it's those two things. It's strategy and it's governance.
Great. How to beat this wonderful introduction. Hello, my name is Simonetta, and I'm the Group Chief Marketing Officer at Evelyn Partners. I'm also the chair of the Surrey Business School Advisory Board, and prior to joining Evelyn Partners, I was a non-executive director at a FTSE 250 wealth management company. I think that what Ruth and Ira have shared is absolutely spot on. I'd like perhaps to bring the perspective of an advisory board when you're doing not-for-profit work, which can be incredibly enriching form of being a non-executive. And my role as the chair is actually to facilitate the dialogue and ensure the balance of voices at the table across people who are doing this really for free in their spare time and just out of the interest of giving back. And still, at the same time, making sure that that dialogue is purposeful, it's focused and it's sharp, and allowing all the different voices and perspectives to really be heard and contribute. When I was on the FTSE 250 board, the reason why I was brought in was often around the board there's not enough representation of the perspective of the customer. And those of you who are in financial services will know that consumer duty regulation that's about to come into play is really making running the business with the customer at the heart central to the agenda of the board. So really helping the board understand how decisions around strategy and governance, the perspective of the customer has to come into it, and data and information around the customer has to be available before these key decisions are made.
And Catherine.
Yeah, so just, I mean, we've covered so much there. The hardest place to go is last. But I think I'd probably add to that on the governance side. It's really scanning for those emerging risks, and especially, again, my background is in financial services. So I sit as a non-exec director for UBank, who are Australia's first digital bank, and they're fully owned by NAB, who are one of the big four banks in Australia. So it's a fairly formal board. We have to take it seriously. So I know as marketers, we're very, very close to the regulatory side of things because we need to make sure we're compliant, obviously, in terms of our campaign execution and communication strategies. But I think taking that a level further and talking about liabilities, and you really, really do need to sort of tighten your view on that. So I suppose the other thing I'd add is a really nice comment around support versus challenge. I think on the soft skills side of things, it's about how do you ask the right questions of the people in the room. So I think, I'm very lucky with UBank. They have some incredibly talented heads of department, senior people in the marketing space as well in the room. And it's not my job to sort of, drill down into exactly how they're doing things, and we need to trust that they're there for a reason. But it's absolutely my job to ask the right questions and sort of make the link between maybe what we talked about in the strategy side of things, what the emerging risks are, what the competitors are doing, the industry overall, and then, just make sure there's no, I suppose, gaps in any of that.
All four of you have spoken about what you can do for the organisation. Ruth, I want to come to you first, and then Catherine. You've worked with some pretty big tech vendors, Avanade, Dimension Data, BT. What can these roles do for you in terms of your own professional development? What can it kind of give you back in terms of skill sets, and how you can translate those into the 9 to 5?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And I think for anyone that's thinking about doing a NED role, this is such a critical point to think through in terms of what are you personally going to learn, as well as what do you have to give. And I think for me, there's been a couple of learnings and things I'm still learning, to be honest with you. But it is this transition from an executive where really our responsibility is to get stuff done, to set the strategy, and then really to make sure that strategy gets executed and that we hit the KPIs and that we are delivering against, the business growth, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas that shift to non-exec is everything we've been talking about, which is you have to unpick yourself and unattach from execution. And that for me has been the biggest learning, because I think certainly in marketing we're such doers. We envisage the future and then we actually make it happen. And as a non-exec, that's absolutely not our job to do the doing. It's to ask the questions, as you said, to make sure we're asking the right questions, and then to understand maybe why there's some hurdles in execution, or maybe why certain things aren't happening. But there is a very clear line between us and the executives in the organisation. So that for me has been a big learning, is to have the patience to step away from the doing and to learn where that line is. I think the second thing for me, and I've deliberately chosen to work alongside not-for-profits in very different industries to the one that I spend my day job in, so in arts, it's just the learning by hanging out and spending time in a very deliberate and material way with people that are in a completely different industry. Because whereas I think certainly in tech, we talk about diversity and inclusion and building diverse teams, you go and put yourself right in the middle of working in an arts organisation, in theatre, and it's like a totally different skill set, sets of people, backgrounds, mindsets, and I'm learning so much from that.
Catherine, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so for me, it was a goal of mine. I suppose, you have your career goals. And for me, I thought, next stage in my career was to look at board positions. And that was professionally to get a bit more exposure to, I suppose, holistically how companies are run. So I think as marketers, we're very naturally curious. And we want to see how everything works. And we're generally not sort of, comfortable coming in, just doing our day job and shutting the outside world out. So I did some advisory pieces with some startups pro bono first and started to really enjoy that and thought, okay, I'd love some more kind of professional experience here and looking at board roles is probably a way to do that. So, speaking to the company I was working with at the time about that was number one goal. But then I actually got approached for the NED position at Eubank, and I thought that's really, really important because, as you say, although they're both in financial services, they're slightly different sectors, and getting into sort of digital banking, neobanks, looking at that explosion of banks across Europe and how they were coming down to Australia, all that sort of stuff just fascinated me. So I thought, this professionally is going to stretch me much further than if I took on a broader role within the organisation I'm with. So that's kind of was the motivation for it. In terms of the learnings, I mean, there's so much, to be honest. I'm 18 months in, and I guess still kind of, every meeting is still enough of a challenge to excite me, to be honest, in terms of the subject matter, but also, covering off all the responsibilities we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Leo, I want to come to you because we had a conversation about this the other day, didn't we? And I guess, what can this role give you that you can't get in your day-to-day? I'm already getting a sense of purpose that perhaps not every organisation ticks that box. What's your experience there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. A number of things for me. In my current role, I'm an exec director, so I sit on the board. And if you'd asked me this question a couple of years ago, I would have given you a different answer. The key thing that I get out of the non-exec roles, in addition to the fact that I'm working in pro bono and therefore feeling as though I'm doing something good for society, is the experience of working with imperfect information. So like most people in the room, again, I'm a marketeer. I love data. Before I was in marketing 20 years ago, I worked in finance, qualified in finance. I've been obsessed by information and data my entire career. Every decision I've made over the years, I've wanted all the facts at my fingertips. I've wanted to be able to compare and contrast and model and evaluate and sensitize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the non-exec roles that I'm in, you don't have that information in front of you. You get a high-level picture from the execs, and you can ask for more, but there's a line over which they don't want to supply, and there's a line over which the time you can dedicate doesn't allow you to get into that. So really what I've taken away is the skill to make decisions based on a thinner, narrower pool of data, and to feel assured around that has been a big change for me after 20 years of being myopically focused on data.
What's your thoughts?
I found being a non-executive director one of the most exciting parts of my development journey and growing as a leader. And I found that actually makes me a better executive, because when you understand what's facing on the other side of the table, when you understand how, as a non-executive, you come in with very limited information and still having huge responsibility for steering the future and the risk picture of a company, then you understand when you're an executive going to present to the board the place that they're going to be in and what they are looking from you as an executive. So from a personal development perspective, I think this has really helped me grow as an executive. And then similarly to you, Leo, I really enjoy the giving back piece. And I enjoy the transforming myself into a different person, right? And playing a different role for whatever, 3-4 times a year, where I get to experiment a little bit also, different ways of influencing and different ways of being me that I can then bring back into my executive role.
Fantastic. I want to come in a second to essentially the development you need to undertake to take such a position. I think that all of you will have some advice for today's audience. But is there any questions from the audience? And if so, please do put your hands up. Yeah, the lady in the front there, if we can get a roving mic. Or you can shout.
I'm really intrigued by how you got into it. So what's the process? Because obviously we all understand the routes in which you get a executive role, but I'm interested to see how you get into it. I know that you mentioned that you were approached, and I was wondering if that was the same for the others, especially when you're going into a totally different sector than the one you're in.
Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to start. I think, without exception, every role I've done has been through my network. So I think there's always, formal searches in the same way there are for our day jobs. But actually, through this, it's been through either somebody who's, already a chair or on the board, and they're looking for someone particularly with international skills or with marketing skills, and it's through talking to someone that they've recommended me. Or through someone I worked with previously. So my advice would be, be very specific with your network if it's something you want to do and what you're looking for.
I think
It's amazing how your network works for you.
And just to add to that, I completely agree. I think majority comes through sort of, put yourself out there that this is now what you're looking for. You build your board persona, which is very different than your sort of exec one. But I think more recently, what I've seen anyway is that boards are actually, thankfully, starting to look, beyond the bubble in terms of bringing new talent in, and that's because a lot of the technology changes, the consumer behavior changes, etc. They need to sort of break those silos. So I think there are the websites that I've been recommended, like Neural, Dynamic Boards, Women on Boards, and even LinkedIn. There's been a few positions advertised on, but I think definitely majority. It seems to be still networks, and actually somebody mentioned to me a really good list of headhunters as well that they're slightly different than your exec headhunters. They specialise in this space, but it would definitely be good to then kind of get your CV in front of them.
In my case, my very first NED came from my company. I was working at Western Union, and they had a foundation. And they, as part of my development, the company actually offered to join the board of the Western Union Foundation. My second one was through Personal Network, and that's still live. It's the Surrey Business School Advisory Board, and that was actually a colleague from university who 30 years down the line remembered. And then the third one was actually through a headhunter search. So there really is a variety of paths into it. If you have a business that has multiple legal entities that have boards, this is a great opportunity actually to get in there and to learn the ropes of a NED. So do speak to your companies about those opportunities, I would say.
Fantastic. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I'll hog the mic, but don't let me do that. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. In terms of kind of preparing to become an NED, I mean, we've kind of touched on some of this in terms of your profile, your networks, even events like this that you could argue have an impact. Leo, what's your thoughts in terms of that journey that you need to go on professionally?
Well, if I reflect on my own journey, excuse me, the starting point was as a volunteer with an organisation called Young Enterprise that some of you might have heard of. If you haven't heard of it, it's an educational charity that helps kids in school learn about business. And right at the beginning of my career, 25 or so years ago, I volunteered to be one of the thousands of advisors that help those mini companies that are run by kids in schools. And in doing that, I started to get a bit of exposure into the non-exec world, albeit for a small micro child-run company in school, so not exactly a FTSE 100 PLC as some of my panelists have. But through doing that, I started to get a sense of what the role was, and I started to network with people outside of my employer. I found at the beginning of my career, I don't know about any of you, my network was largely confined to people I'd studied with and people I worked with. And by getting involved in Young Enterprise, I think I was 22, I started meeting people in the wider world. And over time, that network has borne fruit. And as my peers in that organization have developed and grown, so has my network. So I guess the message I wanted to give is start somewhere and don't be afraid to start small. I think most people, when they think of a non-exec role, they want to be at Coca-Cola or they want to be at IBM or whatever. And that's great if that's what you want and what you can achieve. But I found the route in was to start with something where I could contribute, where the risk was negligible. I mean, these were child-run companies. They weren't listed businesses. But starting with that simple, uncomplicated, unregulated, lacking in fiduciary responsibility role was my route in.
Yeah. Ruth, I'll come to you on this and then Samir, to get your views. On that ethos of starting small, is there an angle there about just almost edging into areas that you perhaps weren't privy to before or had less familiarity? You mentioned legal, I think, right at the start of this conversation, legal, finance. I've heard some people say that becoming on the school, board of governors at a school, for example, is at lower risk. What do you say on that?
So one of the things that I had the opportunity to do about 15 years ago was actually to go on one of the formal courses around becoming a NED. I was sponsored by BT to do it, which I was very fortunate at the time. And that gave me that insight into actually the responsibilities and accountability of a non-exec director and that humility you have to have around the stuff that you need to have a little bit of knowledge that's very broad, but then lean on your colleagues around the rest of the board table that have got deep skills in legal or accounting or recruitment and remuneration in terms of the accountabilities of the board. So if you have the opportunity to do any of those structured courses, I think that really helped me understand that breadth of accountability and what you need to know as a board director. And many of those skills are way out of my comfort zone, or certainly my normal knowledge. So that was really useful. The other thing I think that I'd really encourage you to do, and in hindsight it was really helpful for me, I don't think I did it deliberately, but it was definitely my learning, is go spend time with your non-execs for your company. So when I was at BT, I had the opportunity to sit in a car, very long story, which I won't share, but between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and we got a bit distracted at the border, so we ended up in this car much longer together than we should have been, with Patricia Hewitt, who was one of our non-execs at the time. So I had about 8 hours in this car with her that day to talk to her about her role as a non-exec for BT. And it was fascinating, and it just gave me that insight as to these roles that had always been a little bit ethereal, and I didn't really understand the purpose of a non-exec board. And certainly helped me understand how I could work better with my non-execs at that point. And I think that started shaping my thinking about how I could be a good non-exec for an organisation. So, long story, but kind of go spend time with your board, because it'll help you understand their role better than perhaps we do today.
Samantha, what do you think?
So I would say that the first one is always the toughest. And then once you have your first, then you start being in the consideration set, but there's still work to be done. So I did get on the Surrey Business School Advisory Board and on the board of the foundation, but I was still not feeling like I was on the radar enough for proper FTSE searches. And so I was actually talking to an organization called the Board Apprentice, which I think have a really interesting proposition about placing executives into board as observers and developing them. And as part of this conversation, I also got noticed and put in a report of the top 100 women to watch from Cranfield University. And that immediately shot my profile up on LinkedIn. And literally the day after it was published, I had the Odgers call me and propose the interviews for the role in the FTSE 250. So you do have to, it's a little bit about get started small, educate yourself, and raise your profile, right?
This all sounds wonderful. Catherine, I want to turn the tables a little bit. Is there a possibility you might stretch yourself too thin, both from a time perspective, but also, I think, Ruth, you just referenced this in a way of your own skill set and knowing your boundaries. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think definitely on the time side, I mean, in terms of the skills side, I think, if you've made it that far, it's learning anything, right? You're going to get there, and they've supported you into that role for a reason. But yeah, the time side is it's so different than potentially what is perceived. So the role might be advertised as 6 meetings a year, for example, but then, a week out from each of those meetings, you're going to get a board pack that might be 200 pages long, and it is all interesting stuff, but that's used to take me quite a lot of time to get through that. Now, obviously, the closer you get to the subject matter and the more familiar you get with the people and the format of those board packs, it's quicker. But there's also potentially meetings that have to be called in between the meetings if there's an issue. There's also one-to-ones that, I like to do, maybe with the CEO and induction with the other sort of senior leadership team. So definitely on the time side, when I was working in an exec role at the same time, full-time, it was sort of like a weekend killer for sure. So you have to be, I suppose, really, really passionate. And obviously, I haven't yet had a non-profit board position, but I've heard that on that side, it can even be more of a time drain. So that's the advice I was given, is absolutely make sure that you are passionate about this project, this cause, because you're going to be up in the middle of the night potentially prepping before a meeting the next day. So.
Actually, that leads me quite nicely onto that values piece and aligning that. I mean, Ruth, how important is that when you make a decision? Because I guess, to Catherine's point, you've got to be all in or not at all.
Yeah, I think it's really important because it is one more thing I have to balance with, a big day job. We've all got big day jobs, trying to be a good human being, trying to be a good family member, and then, another role, which is not just 6 board meetings a year, as you said. It's all encompassing, and the understanding the accountability as a board member, that when something happens, you have to be there. So at the Globe, we've just appointed a new CEO, of which involved the whole board getting involved in, all the rounds of the interview process and the governance and the reference finding and a good decision-making progress, which took a lot of time. So kind of trying to juggle priorities, I think, is a skill set. So, if you haven't got the passion for it, or you don't feel connected to the values, or you don't like the people, it's going to be really difficult, would be my guidance. So spending time, it's always flattering if you get approached. It's always great if you get through a process. But then to make sure, in the same way we do this due diligence if you're joining, as an executive, to make sure it's the right cultural fit, that you've got the passion for the organisation, because it's really challenging to prioritise it when there's so many other things and pressures on.
Can I just jump in on that for a second, if I may? And I completely agree with everything you say, but I think you have to be willing to say no, and you have to set boundaries. And maybe I find it easier because I'm in unremunerated non-exec positions. Excuse me. It might be harder if I was being paid for my time, but I've said very clearly to the organisations I support, I'm not going to read material and respond to emails in my normal day job working hours. If there are meetings that are scheduled in advance, that's fine, but I'll give up my own time outside of working hours for emails and for calls, etc. And I think that's important for my life, to your point about juggling, and it's important in setting boundaries. And there are some organisations that wouldn't accept that and wouldn't want you as a non-exec in those constraints, but I don't know how I could do 3 or 4 roles and have several wonderful / annoying children and a full-time job if I didn't do that.
I think it's really important, as Catherine said, to understand the requirements, and the best briefs will be very open and honest about that. When it comes to smaller businesses in particular, I think doing the right due diligence is quite important. I have come across roles where they really wanted a CMO but couldn't afford one, and so the expectation on a board member can become too close to an executive role. So it's really important to understand the business and to ask all the right questions.
Fantastic. I want to continue in that vein in a moment. We've only got 10 minutes left, actually, so if you have any questions, please do raise your hands, and that mic will make its way to you, I can promise you that. Is there a question at the back? No, I'm seeing things. Apologies. Leo, I want to come to you on our conversation we had in preparation for this, and a couple of quotes that stood out for me. One was, "Don't trample the day-to-day," and the other one was, "Read the room, be clear why you're there and the value that you bring." It comes back to that point about boundaries, I guess. Can you just expand on some of those comments?
Yeah. When I started on this path, I wasn't really sure why I wanted to do it. It sounded sexy. It sounded cool. I'd met people who were in these roles, and I thought, yeah, I want to do that. And I met the chairman of one of the boards I later joined, who said to me, being a non-exec, and these are his words, not mine, being a non-exec, it's like being a grandparent. You're there to provide insight and advice from your experience. You're not there to provide orders and instruction to the execs or the parents, but the best thing is at the end of the day, you can give the child back and go home. And that resonated with me, but it got me onto thinking about what my motivations were. And there are 4 things that I can see made me want to be a non-exec that might make others. The first one is around building your skills, learning and development. We've touched on that already. I'm sure most people who look at non-exec roles are interested in that, and that's perfectly valid. The second one for me is about building a professional network, networking with people that can be either helpful to you or your organization. The third, which has certainly motivated me, which I've talked about earlier on with the pro bono roles I have, is about giving back and purpose. But the fourth is about money. And I'm in unremunerated roles. I've chosen that particularly because I work in the professional services space, and there are strict rules about conflicts and independence, so I couldn't take them on. But the point I wanted to make was be clear about your motivations. Why are you there? Is it any of those 4? Is it all of those 4? And if you're clear on that, then you can pick the right roles.
Sumesa, did you want to add to that?
No.
Oh, okay. Final couple of questions from me then, and let's start with Catherine and work this way. The biggest challenge of being a non-exec?
I think, look, we've probably covered it a lot, but as Ruth says, definitely, being able to step out of the detail and asking the right questions. I think challenge, obviously, is you are learning new subject matter, especially if you really jump industries. And you don't have a training period. There's no probation period. There's no sort of soft landing. It is from your first meeting, you need to be all over it and asking the right questions, which I think is quite fair. So I think, I think it's probably just that massive sort of learning at the beginning that I've found the biggest challenge, and maybe ongoing. It is, there's interesting things happening in this company, and you do want to be more involved in what they're doing in this particular area. But as we've probably said a couple of times today, you can't. But then you also need to know enough to be able to help, guide the strategy on that. So that's definitely something that kind of gets played, that dynamic in the boardroom a bit, where you can kind of go a little bit down a wormhole, but then you sort of pull it back fairly quickly. So I'd say that's probably what my challenges are.
Somebody said to me that being a good non-exec is like you need to be able to stick your noses in but keep your fingers out. I think that's really resonated with me. The other important thing is, even though you may be hired because you bring that customer brand digital lens that nowadays boards find very valuable and they don't have, when you're sitting at that table, you need to be able to contribute just like every other board member. And so a majority of the board life is not around strategy. It is around risk committee, remuneration committee, audit committee, nominations committee, and therefore really being willing to put in the time to learn about those aspects, including developing yourself in your own roles and paying attention to risk and risk management is really important. Actually, my chair, when he hired me, he said, I'm going to put you on the risk committee. It's not very sexy, but it's the best way to learn about the business. And so if you have an executive risk committee in your businesses where you work, ask to join and be exposed to that if you're not already exposed to it. I think it makes for great development and preparation for being an ed.
Ruth?
I think one of the most challenging things I still experience is the diversity of background and thought. And I say that in the most constructive way, hopefully, but certainly having always worked in tech, there's a way that most people that work in tech think, and we don't realise that the rest of the world doesn't think that way. And so, sitting around a table, there's some things that I have realised that I assume that everybody knows and understands and can see. So I think one of my challenges has been understanding when to not assume that there's a same level of knowledge, and actually to have the confidence to say the obvious. Because when you're sitting next to somebody that's written screenplays for 30 years and has never been in a corporate environment, and you're talking about capital risk, they know we're both sitting there with a very limited knowledge, but both thinking about it in a very different way. So just that sense of being confident, putting the obvious on the table, because we have a very diverse board if we all speak. So that's, I think, what I still find challenging sometimes is kind of not feeling like it's my subject matter, and certainly in an executive role wouldn't have anything to contribute because there's people around the table that can, but having the confidence to put my thoughts on the table, even if I think they're quite small.
Leo.
For me, the biggest challenge is compartmentalizing. Having a series of different roles, family, a full-time day job, trying to draw boundaries between them, particularly the non-exec and the full-time role, making sure that I'm not bringing information from one to another when there are ethical walls between them, or should be ethical walls, but also stopping my mind thinking about one of those external appointments when I should be thinking about the day job, or vice versa. And that can be quite difficult, especially when you're personally passionate about one of the organizations you're involved in. But I think that's the best way of being able to be objective and independent and not get emotionally invested. And we all want to be engaged in what we do, but you do need in some of these exec roles to be professionally dispassionate. And if you can compartmentalize that, I think that's the best way of achieving it.
Yeah. And the final question, which I'll open up to all of you, or any of you, depending on who wants to take the question on, what advice would you have for the audience today who may be thinking about stepping into a non-executive role for the first time? Who wants to take that?
I don't mind firing something out which touches on what I said earlier on. It's about being authentic, knowing why you want the role, knowing what you can deliver, knowing what your motivations are, and making sure you only look for roles that align. There's no point in going for a pro bono role if you want money, and there's no point in going for money in certain organizations if actually what you want to do is good for society. So figure out what your motivations are, figure out what you're trying to achieve, be honest and transparent about those with the people you meet, be authentic, and that's the best way of ensuring you end up in the right place.
I think just for me, one small thing I'd add is speak to your current employer, not just to sort of get involved in the current committees that are there, but just to understand what boundaries exist when, if you were to be successful in getting a role. There can be so much time wasted if you're sort of out there and talking to chairs and whomever, and then you find out it's potential conflict, or they're not comfortable with X, Y, and Z. So obviously just understanding that, and it might be obvious because there might be hopefully other execs who are doing the same thing, or potentially not. So I think that's probably where I'd start.
I think I would say don't underestimate the value that you can bring. And, coming from someone that's worked in marketing my whole career, I think this is the era for us on boards, whereas traditionally boards have looked for lawyers and accountants. And, I think now there's a great opportunity to bring that customer mindset, the digital mindset, the data mindset. And I think most organizations are really crying out for the skills we've got. So don't undersell yourself and go for it.
And on that vein, be selective. I know, when that brief lands and when you get approached and it's the thing you want to do, it's very tempting to just maybe want to jump in. But the selectiveness, I think, is understand the type of company and the expectations, because what they really want is deeper executive involvement, and that's going to be the case for smaller companies, VC funded, etc. Well, that may be right for you. You may have the capacity to do that, but you may not. And the other thing is the chair and the culture that the chair is creating around the table is so important, especially for a first-time NED. You really want somebody who believes so much in the value that you can add, that are going to make the room and the allowance for your lack of experience. And they'll welcome that as a sign of diversity on the board. But not every chair is like that. Not every board is like that. So do your due diligence, be selective, and don't be too impatient. It'll happen because, as Ruth said, you're going to be hotcakes, because really, especially CMOs that are in tech right now, it's your moment.
Fantastic. Well, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your time and insight today at the studio, and hope you enjoy the rest of the events.